Namaste, Jai Hind. Welcome to another edition of ANI Podcast with Smita Prakash. This is a special edition which is being recorded at the Raisina Dialogue held in March 2023 in New Delhi. Our topic today is about an issue that could turn into a global flashpoint: the South China Sea quagmire, principles or compromise. China is in conflict with its maritime neighbors, and there is an impasse which can negatively impact all of Asia. Before I introduce the guests, here's a short explainer. The South China Sea is one of the busiest waterways. It has several small islands, and the disputes are over the claims made by China, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Taiwan, and Brunei over these waterways that date back almost 70 years. The disputes have affected maritime trade as well as bilateral relations between these two countries. The US is also involved in this dispute as it has maritime security interests in this region. What is India's interest in this dispute? Well, 55% of India's trade passes through the Straits of Malacca, which opens into the South China Sea. Over to the experts we have today. Dr. Lynn Kuok, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Singapore. She's got a stellar academic career. Lynn Kuok is a visiting professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and has held fellowships at Yale Law School, Harvard Law School, Harvard Kennedy School, and NUS Singapore. Dr. Satoru Nagao, non-resident fellow at the Hudson Institute, USA. Satoru Nagao has held numerous research positions in diplomatic and political field. He's also been a security analyst at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Professor Rory Medcalf, Professor and Head of National Security College, ANU, Australia. He has 3 decades of experience across diplomacy and intelligence analysis, academia and journalism. He's a serving board member of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations at the ANU Cyber Institute and an Australian representative on the ASEAN Regional Forum Register of Experts and Eminent Persons. Dr. Kuok, I'll begin with you. Is it possible for China to break the current impasse in the South China dispute? The COVID years have not seen China showing any signs of accommodation. So do you think that this impasse can stop now?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on this show. On your question, I'm not entirely confident. In fact, I'm not confident at all that the impasse can be broken. There's been recent talks about how countries, both from Southeast Asia as well as China, would like to push for intensifying the Code of Conduct negotiations. However, we've heard that before, most recently in 2020, and nothing has come of that. And of course, if we think about it, these Code of Conduct negotiations have been in the making for some 2 decades now, with very little to show for. I think there are several things that stand in the way of concluding a meaningful code of conduct, which will help to, if not break the impasse, but at least to reduce the impasse. Things like the scope of application of the code of conduct, whether it should apply to the entirety of the South China Sea as China would want, or only in areas of dispute, the sort of dispute resolution mechanism, whether it should merely be bilateral negotiations with China, or parties would have ability to have recourse to the mandatory dispute resolution mechanisms and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So there are these stumbling blocks to concluding a meaningful code of conduct. That said, I think China has every reason to seek to help to reduce tensions with its neighbors, given that its competition with the United States is fast heating up. So I think it makes sense. If I were China, I would be seeking to reduce tensions with my neighbors, especially since those tensions have allowed the United States to forge stronger ties with even erstwhile with countries like Vietnam, with whom it fought 2 decades worth of a war. So I think, if China were thinking strategically about its position in the region, it would certainly be seeking to break this impasse and forge stronger ties with its neighbors.
Mm-hmm. And even recharge relationships which had, stagnated, like say maybe with Philippines. I'm going to come to you, Dr. Nagao. You've studied and written about the role of Quad and the close ties between India and Japan, with regard especially to expansionist China. Why is there no coordinated strategy among Asian countries to resolve the South China dispute?
To deter China's territorial expansion, we need to check the pattern of China's territorial expansion. there are three features. Firstly, they ignore the international rule. For example, what happened in the East China Sea is the example. Before the 1970s, they haven't claimed the Senkaku Island of Japan is their territory. So since 1971, they realized how important, and they start to claim this is their territory, but this is ridiculous view from the international law. And secondly, is when they find the power vacuum, they try to steal it. So, for example, what happened in South China Sea is 1950s when France withdrew from this region, they take the half of the Paracel Island. In 1970s, when US withdrew, another half of the Paracel Island taken by China. And in 1980s, when Soviet troops withdrew from Vietnam, they take the 6 feature of the Spratly Island. In 1990s, when the US withdrew from Philippines, they take the Mischief Reef. So they are thief. When they find the power vacuum, they steal it. Military balance has changed, they steal it. That is a pattern. And the third pattern is their effort is including economic effort or other aspect, not only the military. That is another effort. So BRY is one example. So to deter China's territorial expansion, how to do that? Yes, that their budget is increasing very high. So to maintain military balance, we should increase the defense budget. That's true. But China is rich, not easy. So that's why another method is needed. That's why Quad, we can point it out to deter China's expansion in South China Sea. If the Quad four-country cooperate, China need to divide their budget, the multi-direction, against Japan, against India, against Southeast Asian countries, because cooperation to support Southeast Asian countries by using the Quad framework. And so that's why to maintain military balance, built from the budget, this cooperation is effective. So China cannot move, even if in the South China Sea, if we cooperate enough. That's why Quad and the South China Sea issue is combined. Long explanation. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that's kind of revolutionary, or should I say that would make China more wary, or even Russia more wary about, have the Quad getting military connotations. Professor Medcalf, I come to you. Australia is seen as a kind of a middle power in and an ally of the US, which has interests in South China Sea. Can it risk a conflict with China? And will it engage more for conflict resolution now, especially with the Quad, as was said, that the Quad has strategic interests now? So will it become more involved in conflict resolution?
Look, thank you. And I think that Australia's role, like so many other powers in the world, is one of a stakeholder in the security and stability of the South China Sea. I think it's really important to put the South China Sea in that global context. It is, if you like, everyone's business. It's so vital to international connectivity, to maritime trade, global commons, fisheries, and also as a laboratory, if you like, as to whether multiple nations can resolve essentially territorial differences. And I will come back to your answer about Australia, but just to note that there are some green shoots, some positive signs. Look at Indonesia and Vietnam, for example, essentially agreeing on the demarcation of their EEZ boundaries recently. So there are law-based solutions if players, and of course the big player being China, were ever willing to actually countenance them. Where Australia comes into the picture is, you're right, as a stakeholder, as an ally of the United States, but also as an independent power in the Indo-Pacific. And I guess I believe our government's trying to do multiple things here. On the one hand, we're asserting our rights as, if you like, a power that relies on the South China Sea for our own economy. So rights of overflight, transit, freedom of navigation are of great interest to Australia, even if we're not doing traditional, or conventional FONOPs. But our Air Force does maritime surveillance there, as we've done for 30 or 40 years. And we are interested in a strategic balance, an equilibrium in the region where China can't be coercive or assertive at the expense of others. But we're also interested in preventing escalation. And I think that I wouldn't necessarily call it conflict resolution because we're a long, long way from that. But Australia, like so many other powers now, has an interest in ensuring that on the one hand, aggressive action is deterred, but that in doing that, we're not further destabilising the situation. So therefore, there's a lot of talk now of guardrails, of confidence-building measures, of risk reduction measures. The code of conduct may not be the solution there because, as we've heard, it's moved at a glacial pace, and China has almost sought to weaponise those negotiations in ways that exclude legitimate global stakeholders in the South China Sea from actually being in the South China Sea. But there is, I think, a renewed interest now in using, for example, regional fora, regional groupings to set some standards to reduce the risks of conflict and escalation there. And that's something that I would encourage India, for example, to take a closer interest in.
China has this, it's particularly irked about AUKUS. And it sees that it's born out of a Cold War mentality. Some of the politicians are even making veiled threats against Australia. What is the perception in Australia? Is China viewed as a threatening power at all, or does trade surmount everything else?
There are so many answers to that question. There's so many questions embedded there. Look, I think the long story of the Australia-China relationship, just as China's relations with many other powers over the past decade, has been that you can't separate the economics and the security, the economics and the strategy. If you develop an economic dependence on China, then you're in trouble in the long run, whether that's Australia or whether that's countries elsewhere in the world. You mentioned the technology sharing arrangement that's been labelled AUKUS. But that's really just one piece of a much larger regional puzzle of balancing. So AUKUS is essentially Australia working with two very trusted partners to build stronger capabilities so that a stronger Australia can be a stronger partner to others in the region. The fact that we're now considering building the kinds of submarines that China already has all over the South China Sea. So don't forget that in a sense, Australia, like others, whether it's India or Japan or others, is literally trying to catch up and balance and protect our interests. Of course, that's irking China because it's reinforcing the realisation in Beijing that it can't dominate the region. So it's going to play a very aggressive campaign of disinformation to suggest that somehow those reacting to China's military modernisation are the destabilisers, whereas the truth is precisely the other way around. And to conclude on that point, where the current Australian government is going, I think, is a relationship of stabilising ties with China, but not walking back on any of the national security measures we've taken to protect our interests as a sovereign power. And that includes developing substantial naval capabilities, such as through AUKUS.
Lynn, I'm going to come back to you. You're based in Singapore, so not technically so close to the South China Sea problem, but you've been watching the whole Quad fracas which happened here in New Delhi. The foreign ministers meeting, apparently the South China Sea did come up for discussion, and the statement is indicative that the members kept reiterating that Quad is not a military alliance, but Russia doesn't believe in that. China, of course, will not believe that. And there are strong overtones about China. The whole thing that they're saying, we strongly support, I'm quoting, we strongly support the principles of freedom, rule of law, sovereignty, territorial integrity, peaceful settlement of disputes without resorting to threat or use of force, freedom of navigation, overflight, oppose any unilateral attempt to change the status quo, all of which are essential to the peace, stability, prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. These are all veiled, may not be threats, but signaling to China, isn't it?
Yes, I think the short answer to your question is yes. I think there are implicit or veiled criticisms of China's behavior in the South China Sea in that statement. You mentioned the Quad earlier and how it's perceived in the region. I think the first point to note is that whereas when we first when the Indo-Pacific concept or strategy first emerged, a few years ago, countries in Southeast Asia were very hesitant to kind of go on board with that concept because they worried about what China might think, what it might mean for ASEAN, etc. Come the Quad, when that came along, I think you saw countries, in a sense, being more accepting of alternative, frameworks or architectures or overlapping architectures for helping to manage disputes in the region or, balance the power in the region. So, for instance, Singapore said that the Quad was to be welcomed if it brought greater peace and stability to the region, and if it, complemented ASEAN's role in the region as well. And you had the Philippines foreign minister then, who talked about the Quad being welcomed because, frankly, ASEAN didn't seem able of on its own managing the region's problems. And the region's problems are many. It's China's behavior in the South China Sea, the sort of, objections to valid assertions of rights, navigational rights and freedoms that you highlighted in the statement. It's, the implicit threat or use of force to resolve those disputes. And it's encroachments upon the exclusive economic zones of various coastal states in the south, surrounding the South China Sea, which really is the bread and butter, or the fish and oil and gas, which helps sustain the livelihoods of, in many cases, very poor Southeast Asian countries. So yes, those statements, that statement was in fact a veiled criticism of China's behavior. But I think going beyond that, I think we also need to think a little bit about how, other countries might be contributing to instability in the region. I don't buy China's narrative that it is the United States and its warships or other naval powers that are destabilizing the region by its warships. I think those are us helping to keep the South China Sea open by asserting lawful navigational rights and freedoms. But I think there are certain acts that perhaps could be avoided, like painting the current geopolitical competition between the United States and China as having an ideological basis. I don't think that necessarily helps improve the situation because it introduces more problems into the already mounting list of problems that the United States and China already face.
Speaking of warships, why has the US Navy sent Nimitz? It's one of the oldest nuclear-powered ships. What combat value can it bring?
I think the US, as well as other naval powers, France, for instance, or even other European powers, Australia, etc. They send various naval vessels into the region, perhaps sometimes to demonstrate strength and resolve, but also there's a symbolic value to these various deployments. I think it's very important that the US, as well as others, send naval vessels to the region to highlight that they are merely asserting lawful rights that are vested under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea when they apply the waters of the South China Sea. And I think, we shouldn't always be thinking about military might and what a particular asset brings to the table in terms of military might. We must also think about what it means symbolically. The optics, but symbolically. So when Europe or other middle powers send vessels to the region to support or promote the rules-based order, I think that sends a strong message. It sends the message that it isn't just about US-China competition. What's at stake here isn't, US-China competition and the US seeking to dominate the region over China, but it's also about just, we're concerned about the rules-based order. We're concerned about what happens in the region. We're concerned that, if there are disputes, that's fine, but let's have the disputes resolved or managed in accordance to international law, the guardrails that I've already mentioned earlier.
Right. Dr. Nagao, I'm going to come to you. The Philippines is in talks to possibly include Australia and Japan in sea patrols with the US. So one question on that. And the second question is that, the countries in the immediate vicinity of China, they face similar kind of threat. But I asked you this even in the beginning. Why is there no coordinated system to deal like a coordinated security system? You talked about increasing military budgets, but there needs to be more than that to secure these regions, don't you feel?
Of course, coordination is best, but all these countries are sovereign country, independent country, so they have their attitude, they have their strategy. So coordination is a very tough job. In this case, of course, United States should show the leadership. In this region, for a long time, hub and spoke system is a main system to maintain the balance. Hub and spoke means that United States is center, and based on the bilateral alliance between the U.S. and Japan, U.S. and Australia, U.S. and the Philippines, bilateral basis alliance consists of full security system. In this case, all of the information gathered in the United States, but Japan and the Philippines do not share the information. Japan and Australia do not share the information, even if they are ally of the United States. So in this case, if the coordination move, we should establish. In this case, U.S. lead all of the activity. But the United States need to deal with many issues in the world now. So in this case, they need to deal with Russia, Ukraine, or they need to deal with the Middle East. So under such kind of situations, United States asks the allies should share more security burden in this region. And Japan tried to reply it, Philippines tried to reply it. So coordination has just started. So under such kind of situations, this coordination is, yes, improving, but under process. Not established like NATO, because they have the long history, but we do not have the long history in this region, in the Indo-Pacific. That's why that coordination hasn't happened, but improving. That is my answer to your question, I think.
Right. Do you think that there is a hesitation in that we don't want to become a NATO?
NATO, because you can compare the geographical area. NATO in Europe, in the Mercator-based map, Europe is very big, but indeed Europe is more small region. So it is more easy to coordinate. But in the Pacific, very, very, very big.
Yeah.
So in this case, coordination is a very, very big, tough job. So, of course, if we can establish this Asian NATO, it will be a very effective way to deter China. That's true. China's ally is only one, North Korea. The treaty-based allies on North Korea. And Russia, Pakistan, or Myanmar, they will be the partner, but not formal ally. United States side, 52 allies, even if we only count treaty-based ally. And so, coordination itself is very difficult, but achieves some part of it. Not China. The United States has achieved. And this number of the coordination is decisive factor in the last three competitions in the past, the World War I, the 32 versus 4, the 32 win. And World War II, the 54 versus 8, the 54 win. And the Cold War between US and Soviet in 54 win and 26 lose. So in this case, this number is very big, important. So that's why you are right. The coordination of the many countries is very important. But because of these many countries, it is not easy to achieve. That's what happened, I think.
So, Rory, I'm going to come back to you. Is this hub and spoke and bilateral security mechanisms, will that work, or is there possibility of a new Indo-Pacific security initiative coming up in the near future?
Well, I think I'd reinforce the assessments of my colleagues on the panel here about the complexity of the regional security architecture. There's no one size fits all. There's no regional NATO, nor is the region going to solve all of its problems purely through the well-meaning multilateralism of ASEAN or ASEAN-centric institutions. There's, I guess, a multi-layered solution here, or at least a multi-layered way of managing the strategic problem. And the strategic problem is, at one level, ensuring that coercion doesn't succeed, that might does not make right, but also that stability can be maintained in the process. The hub and spokes model, where the United States was the centre of a system of bilateral alliances, it still exists, but it's evolving. And we're now seeing, of course, the spokes being connected. So a web arrangement. The Quad obviously is important in that, but also the trilaterals: Australia, Japan, the United States. Australia, Japan, India, the United States. You can go on. We're even doing things now with the French or with the Indonesians as well. And so all of that I see essentially as adjuncts to or supports to the the alliance-based system, that is where deterrence resides. Deterrence against China resides through the US and its bilateral alliances. But to manage stability, so deterrence in the bilateral alliances, soft balancing through the minilaterals, the 3 and the 4-sided polygons, but then stability can be reinforced through the multilateral and multipolar nature of the region. So, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, all of these institutions that so far have underperformed and so far have not lived up to their promise, but actually have strategic stability, confidence building, preventive diplomacy written into their mandates which actually China accepted once upon a time. We don't need to create a whole new Indo-Pacific security architecture, and that may sound a little strange coming from someone who's a strong advocate of the Indo-Pacific as a strategic system. But, of course, a one-size-fits-all that brings in all of the small countries of the region is going to be incredibly unwieldy. It's the minilaterals, like the Quad, that can provide the glue that connects the other parts of the system. The Quad is, I think as we heard in this conference at Raisina, a lighthouse. I call it a kind of an island of trust. And we've got to keep expanding that island of trust, the Quad engaging with other partners in development and capacity building, and all the while keeping open the door for communication with China, because in many ways there's nothing that's sort of accommodating or surrendering about having a relationship of dialogue with China. It's actually trying to persuade China that all of these other diplomatic arrangements are there for a stability that is actually, I think, going back to your point, Lynn, in China's interest. So let's keep that message getting through. So
what is the red line that could make things difficult for China? Suppose they were to, if the military drills that they're doing right now with Taiwan, if they cross over, if that happens, then what? Because is there a plan B? Right now, what you're seeing is this loosely held hub and spoke model. But what happens if there is some kind of a direct conflict? Then what happens?
So you're taking us to a very grim place here.
But after the Ukrainian situation, you have to have that.
Yeah, no, I'll answer the question. I mean, it is the key question. What happens when literally the balloon goes up? In the ugliest way possible. Well, I wouldn't, in that context, I wouldn't call hub and spokes loose. I mean, the US-Japan alliance, the US-Australia alliance, they are serious alliances with mutual obligations. And although I think it's difficult to speculate about what the deterrent balance or response would actually look like in a Taiwan conflict, it would be formidable. And the whole point, of course, is to ensure that the conflict doesn't happen in the first place. So I would argue that a US-led strategic response to whether it's a Taiwan crisis, whether it's an East China Sea conflict, whether it's a South China Sea conflict, there are so many flashpoints. I mean, and then, of course, we haven't talked about India-China as well. That's one vital part of the deterrent puzzle. But I think what isn't really well understood yet here is what an immediate global crisis a Taiwan conflict would be. Just as the Ukraine war, Russia's aggression against Ukraine precipitated a global crisis, even more so, I think, in the case of Taiwan. So many countries would have to shut down their economic relations with China overnight, which would be catastrophic for China and the global economy. If we can weaponise that message ahead of time, and that's a message to every global stakeholder, it's a message to Europe, it's a message to India and to others, then I think we actually stand a chance of preventing that disaster you speak of in the first place.
Right. Lynn, I'm going to come to you. At the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, the Indian External Affairs Minister said, and I'll quote him, for 45 years there was peace, there was stable border management, and then no military, he's talking about India-China, and then no military casualties on the border since 1975. That changed because we had agreements with China not to bring military forces to the border, which is the line of actual control that we have, and the Chinese violated those agreements. He went on to say that the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. And so how does the world see the India-China border conflict? We talked about Taiwan with Rory. How does the world see the India-China border conflict? Is it as concerned as it is with the Taiwan situation or with the maritime conflicts which are going on, China's maritime conflicts in East Asia and the South China Sea?
I think the suggestion in your question is a correct one, namely that the concern about the India-China border dispute is less in the region than it is, say, over the South China Sea dispute, given in Taiwan, of course, given, I guess, the geographical, you just feel a bit more geographically distant from the India-China dispute. That said, I think it is a very important dispute insofar as if it is resolved by force, that undermines the UN Charter against the use of force and more broadly undermines international law. And so I think just as I have very strongly advocated that all countries should be concerned about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I would similarly say that all countries should be concerned that the dispute over the Indian-China border, I think that too should be resolved in accordance with international law, and countries should be concerned about that as well. You know, who owns what, where, I think that's less important. So in the South China Sea, my concern is less over the territorial dispute because countries can argue, perhaps by showing evidence, that one or another has a better claim over these features in these land features in the South China Sea. What concerns me there is that the maritime domain, where there are clear principles under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that has to be clearly delimited or attributed, or sovereign rights given under the convention. So, the adherence to the rule of law, that part of it is very important. So perhaps countries, do not need to take a position on who has a better claim on the disputed border, but they do need to take a strong position that, international law should be upheld and there should be no use of force on that border.
Okay. Dr. Nagao, I'm going to come to you. Final questions. The same question which I asked, how does the world and how does Japan see the India-China conflict, the border conflict? One, that. And the second question is, since the wars, Japan's military budget, it hasn't increased so much as we saw now. I think 836 billion is what the military budget is for the next fiscal. It seems to indicate to us that Japan is preparing for some kind of a conflict. So tell us how that happens, because you said military budgets. I'm going to go back to that early point that you made, that military budgets have to be stepped up in this region if we have to be pragmatic about the conditions that we have right now in Asia.
Yeah, that's a very good question, I think. I repeatedly say how to maintain military balance is the main point of the counter-China strategy. That's true. So how dividing the China's budget in the multi-direction is a good way. If Japan possesses the counter-strike capability and India possesses strike capability, China cannot ignore the two sides at the same time. Australia will possess submarine-based cruise missile capability soon. In this case, China cannot ignore the attack from Australia, even if Australia is located far from China. So that's why the Quad will work to maintain military balance if they possess the strike capability. With the United States, all of 4 countries will possess the strike capability. But at the same time, to deter China's invasion to Taiwan or China's expansion in territory in the South China Sea, indeed, other aspect is also needed. For example, the economy. If the countries like Japan, Australia, or India rely on the trade with China, in this case, China expect they will not intervene because they sacrifice this benefit. Can they do that? No, China will think. In this case, China think, when we invade Taiwan, we can win. Something like that, because the other country will not react to it. So that's why we should not rely on the trade with China. Supply chain should diverse, or we should not rely on China. Anyway, in this case, that is also needed. That's why TPP, the IPEF, this kind of the economic framework, the US suggests, or Japan try to lead. Currently, TPP is not American project now, Japan's project, despite America said first time. And Another method is also the international status of Taiwan. Taiwan is independent country. Yes, no one doubt it indeed. But China said this is not. So we need to raise their status. In this case, it looks like when China invade Taiwan, in this case, everyone see this is invasion. This is a violation of the international law. In this case, many countries support Taiwan. So China expects such kind of situation and gave up to invade. That is the ideal situation for us. So, but if we ignore this status, maybe China think, world will ignore Taiwan and we can invade and we will win, something like that. So, rise the international status of Taiwan is deterring China's invasion. So, in this case, the contribution of India is very important, and Japan, why we focus on national security strategy now is because there is a possibility the situation will appear that China can invade Taiwan soon. That's why we must decide. We cannot ignore Taiwan. If China starts to invade, if Japan will not allow the United States to support Taiwan, automatically China can win in the Taiwan, we think. That's why Japan cannot escape from the situation. We need to support the US, we need to support Taiwan. So that's why the Taiwan crisis is emerging. We must do something. But in this case, India's role is also very important. In this, when we check India's diplomatic activity toward Taiwan, indeed, India is raising Taiwan's status in the international stage. That has started in 1995, re-establish a diplomatic relation with Taiwan, even if informal. And since 2008, when we check the public document of India, we cannot find any word of the one China policy. So India's and Surawaj, foreign minister, pointed out in 2014, if China asked India to adopt one China policy, China should accept one India policy. This means that Arunachal Pradesh was a territorial issue. Maybe China gave up and accept this is India's territory. So that is the right thing because yes, India's claim is legal one, right one. That's why. So India is right. But in this case, India's activity toward Taiwan rise the international status of Taiwan and prevent China's invasion toward Taiwan. I think so. That's why India's role is very important. I think. I should stop it. Sorry, wrong explanation.
No, that's fine. Rory, I'm going to come to you. One, the same thing, which we discussed. How does the world view the India-China conflict, which you mentioned early? The second one is that, the ASEAN region, you mentioned the ASEAN region. Now, for almost 10 years, whenever I would go to cover the ASEAN meets, I would always see that, there's this consensus actually that erosion of America's strength in the ASEAN region had started taking place in the India-Pacific region. And the dynamics of, I think America got involved in their own issues. They were not paying attention to what was happening in the Indo-Pacific. That kind of changed with Quad to some extent and, with President Trump. China kind of capitalized on that, ignoring that America did. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. Is it too late now for the American involvement? Has the horse left now? There's no point bolting the door.
Good questions. There's a lot there. Look, on the India-China relationship, I think it is important that the international community focuses much more on this. I think the violence in the Galwan Valley in 2020 was a very, very bracing moment internationally. The Doklam incident in 2017, likewise. And speaking personally, I would like to see more countries really openly recognising, that India has really been the target of quite an aggressive position by China on the border and supporting India more openly. Now, I don't think that the Quad is going to turn magically into a military alliance. I don't think you're going to see, and I don't think India would want, direct military support, if you like, the front line on the disputed border in the Himalayas. But there's all kinds of indirect support that the Quad and other partners should be giving to India at every stage of this dispute, whether it's in, whether it's in capability, whether it's in intelligence, whether it's diplomatically, and likewise, I think they're the kinds of expectations we would place on India if there were crises in East Asia. Going to your question about ASEAN and really the broader region and the American role here, I think that the death of America as a decisive power in the Indo-Pacific has been prematurely announced many times, and I think now is another of those occasions. I think what the Biden administration is demonstrating is that America is back in a comprehensive way, and importantly, it's not only in a military sense, it's also improving from a low base, if you like, geoeconomic engagement, but it's improving it. And of course, there's a big base if you think about private sector American investment in the region, which is massive. So we need to somehow mobilise that for the strategic competition. America will stay, in my view, in the Indo-Pacific. If the United States is serious about competing with China, it cannot compete with China without playing a strategic role in the world's pivotal region. And I think both sides of American politics now understand that. So for friends of the United States and allies, we just have to help shape and moderate that role in ways that support stability as well as deterrence. And there's a role there for ASEAN. I think the ASEAN institutions that we speak of there, while they may underperform in some ways, have maintained levels of dialogue, levels of internal balance and stability within ASEAN. And really now is the time for those institutions and leaders within those institutions to step up and send concerted messages to China that it can't dominate this multipolar region.
Right. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you, Dr. Lynn. Thank you so much for explaining this very complex issue about the South China conflict. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you for watching or listening into this episode of ANI Podcast with Smita Prakash at the Raisina Dialogue. Namaste. Jai Hind.